Digital transformations are often viewed as a jungle. They can be dangerous, they can be chaotic, and they can be very disruptive. But there are good ways to get out of this and to navigate the jungle of digital transformation. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for joining our weekly live stream. My name is 𝗟𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗡. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech agnostic consulting company that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And I'm excited for today's discussion because I'm going to discuss my new book, which is called Welcome to the Jungle, Strategies to Manage Digital Transformation and to Navigate the Chaos of Digital Transformation. So that's a bit about what we'll talk about here today. In fact, if you'd like to pre-order my book or read more about it and see what it's all about, you can scan this QR code right here at the top left of your screen. Or if you go to Amazon, just search my name, you'll find it as well. But the book is called Welcome to the Jungle. And that's what today's discussion is going to be about, is how to overcome some of the challenges of these digital transformations and those sorts of projects, whether it's ERP, CRM, or AI, HCM, whatever type of technology you might be deploying. We want to talk about some of the common challenges that organizations face when going through these sorts of transformations. So, one thing that I struggled with after I wrote my last book was called The Final Countdown. It was about digital strategy and how to manage digital transformations. One thing I noticed about that book, even though I am proud of it, it's my first book, I'll always be proud of it, but I felt like it was a bit too academic and theoretical. So I wanted to write a book that was more case study driven, giving specific examples, talking about specific projects and failure points. And so that was really the premise of wanting to write this book, was not only to make it more case study driven and make it more relatable and more tangible, but also to talk more about failures and the root causes of failure. So rather than talking about academic theoretic stuff, or rather than talking about something very specific to digital transformation, like change management or good project management, how important that can be to a project, I didn't want to focus just on one discipline within digital transformation. I wanted to talk about what are the root causes of failures when companies struggle with their implementations. And there's plenty of data out there, plenty of studies out there that confirm and validate that most digital transformation projects fail. In fact, the numbers have been pretty steady over the last couple of decades, right at anywhere from 70 or 80% or more. Whether you look at Gartner, McKinsey, Bain, any of those big consulting and analyst firms that study these sorts of projects, they'll consistently tell you that most of these projects fail. And in fact, when you look at AI initiatives, I've seen even higher numbers, as high as 95% of AI initiatives failing. And you think, well, AI has so much potential, there's so much hype around it, how could it possibly fail? And why are companies struggling so much? And the good news, bad news is it's nothing different than they've struggled with for the last couple of decades. If I look at the failure points that organizations have been struggling with since I started my career, it's a lot of the same mistakes, a lot of the same patterns that we're starting to see over the years, or that we're continuing to see over the years as organizations continue to make the same sorts of mistakes. And so that's what we want to talk about here today, is dive into a few case studies from the book, Welcome to the Jungle, which again, if you're just joining now, you can scan this QR code right here and you can access that book. You can pre-order it. It's going to be released in just a few days on the 28th of September. So you can pre-order it. You can also get a paper copy and hardcover copy as of the 28th when it's released. So be sure to check that out. But we're going to talk today about some of the highlights from the book, some of the case studies and some of the findings from the book. I want to summarize for you what is in that book. But before I jump in here, even further than I already have, I'd love to hear where in the world you're joining from today. So whatever city and country you're joining from, love to hear your feedback. So please drop in the chat what city and country are you joining from. I'm keeping an eye on the chat here. I'm going to take your questions too. So any questions you have, please feel free to chime in and drop those in the chat. I'm watching it across all the major platforms here. So love to hear your feedback. And in addition to letting me know what city and country you're joining from, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat and let me know what you think the number one cause of failure is. What have you seen to be the biggest problem in these sorts of digital transformations? Or if you've never been through one, or you haven't really experienced the pain of one, what do you think the biggest problem would be, or the biggest challenge would be for digital transformations? I'd love to hear your feedback. So drop that in the chat as well, if you don't mind. City and country you're joining from, as well as letting me know what some of the biggest challenges are that you're facing. So I want to say hello to some people joining here today that have dropped in the chat where they're joining from and saying hello here. So thank you, Darian, joining out in LinkedIn. Good morning. We have Sanjay joining on LinkedIn as well. Sam Graham joining on LinkedIn from Spain. So thank you for being here today. And Darian's joining from Denver. And we also have someone joining from Tampa, Florida, although I can't see the name of the person that's joining from sunny Tampa, Florida. So I'm envious that you're in sunny Florida, because as you can see behind me, it's very rainy where I am here today at a client. And if you hear background noise like you just did a moment ago, it's because I'm in a semi-public place that I don't normally do my podcast from. So thank you for your patience here, and love to hear any questions you have, and look forward to seeing your comments on what you think the biggest failure points are. So I talked about a little bit about why I wrote the book, and it really was intended to help leaders survive and thrive in what is typically a chaotic environment. So when organizations go through these sorts of projects, they're always going to be disruptive. They're always going to be somewhat messy, somewhat chaotic. But I think organizations create a lot of self-inflicted harm that doesn't need to be as complicated as it is. So many organizations make the same mistakes, as I mentioned before. They're making a lot of the same mistakes that they were making 10, 20, 30 years ago. So why is that? Why has technology advanced so much? We presumably, as an industry, have surely learned our mistakes over the last few decades, but for some reason, we haven't. The industry continues to struggle. Our project recovery practice, which is the part of our business where we help companies that have failed in their implementations, we help get them back on track, or in some more extreme cases, they're in the lawsuit stage of a project. So there's litigation happening, whether it's arbitration or through a court system. We'll get hired as an expert witness in those cases. But if you look at all of our project recovery and expert witness work that we do as a company, it's well over half of our revenue is coming from failed and troubled implementations. And while this might be good for our business, it's not good for the industry, and it's not good for our clients. And so I would much rather help more companies avoid some of these common challenges and sticking points and stumbling points, help them avoid that from the start, and certainly hire us for potentially other types of work. And hold on one second here. Okay, sorry about that. I'm a nomad today, bouncing around from conference room to conference room. So apologies for that break there. So that's some of the things we want to talk about. Is why are companies continuing to struggle even though they've spent decades learning, and technology has advanced so much over the years. Sam has an interesting question here. Sam on LinkedIn says many companies don't fully understand what they're getting into. These projects need to start with education for the C-suite and the core internal team. So I think that's absolutely right. You need to go in with your eyes wide open, and certainly sharing content like this with leaders throughout your organization or your peers is one way to do that. Sharing thought leadership like this conversation, like the book that I'm publishing, other thought leadership that's out there from others. You want to make sure that people really understand what they're getting themselves into, because it's easy to get into these projects with rose-colored glasses and have an overly optimistic view of these projects and how they're going to go. And we all want to be optimists. We want to plan aggressively. We want to plan for success. But we also want to recognize that the only way we can be successful is if we see the pitfalls and the landmines along the way, and we know how to avoid them. We learn how to avoid them. Pitfalls and landmines aren't going anywhere. They're always going to be there. But the key is, how do we mitigate the risk, and how do we avoid stepping on them? And it's always amazing to me that organizations continue to step on the same landmines that we'll get into here today. I also want to say to Mohammed on YouTube, joining from Iran, thank you for joining here today. Babulal, joining from a remote village in India, thank you for being here today. I appreciate having you here. And then we also have Tom Weeks joining on LinkedIn, I believe it is. Whoops. Yep. So thanks for joining here today. Another comment here that's really interesting. We're already getting straight into prescriptive mode here and looking for solutions. So thank you for your comment here. Sanjay says most of the companies don't invest much in upskilling the employees in technology sector and have realistic change management, which is a really, really good point. Excuse me. I have a dry cough today, so this live stream is turning out to be a complete disaster so far. So thanks for sticking with me here. So want to shift gears and really talk through, why the jungle metaphor or analogy. And first of all, many of you may recognize the song, the song title in the title of the book, "Welcome to the Jungle," and that's one of my favorite songs from the '80s rock era. And I also think that it's a great analogy for digital transformations because companies are going through a jungle. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of surprises. A lot of things that can derail you if you aren't prepared for it. And that was really the premise of the book and why I wanted to name it "Welcome to the Jungle." It has the rock and roll connection, as much of my content does, and it also creates a what I consider to be a powerful analogy behind what leadership teams are going through and what they should be prepared to expect when they go through these projects. So that's the premise for the title, and it's full of unknowns. There's predators, there's storms, there's dead ends. When you think of a jungle, those are the things you typically think of. You think of wild animals and danger, and you've got to be aware. You've got to be alert. You've got to be a little bit paranoid. You can be optimistic. You need to have a compass, a map, a roadmap to get out of the jungle. And that's a lot like what we're doing here as leaders. Is just like explorers, companies tend to lead without a proper map. Companies are a guide. And if an explorer doesn't have a proper map, compass, or guide, or isn't aware of the risk of where they're going, they're probably not going to survive in the jungle. And that's why a lot of organizations tend to struggle, is they aren't prepared. They don't have the right roadmap, or they have a biased roadmap that a vendor created for them, or a technology implementation partner or a system integrator created for them. And typically that is not a complete or realistic plan of how to get out of the jungle. It's only giving you one tool that you might need to manage your entire journey. So we also want to ensure that, we want to recognize that most failures come from misjudging the environment. It's not from technology alone. It's pretty rare that we go into a transformation in a recovery mode, help a client get back on track and find that, wow, this technology is really screwed up, or this technology just isn't fit for purpose, or this technology wasn't designed and deployed well. Now, it may not have been designed and deployed well in a way that matches the business, but technically speaking, the software oftentimes works. And so the challenge is typically less related to the technology and a lot more related to the people and process side of things. So that's the next thing to recognize is that piece of it, that there's so much of a challenge there as it relates to the environment, to the people and process sides of things, the alignment, making sure your leadership is educated. But as I think Sam mentioned a moment ago, those are all very important things to recognize here. So as I continue here, I want to get into a few other comments here. One from LinkedIn, from 𝗷𝗂𝗡𝗦𝗢. How do we bridge the critical in transit phase where both current systems and future AI platforms fall short of being the sole source of truth? And that's a great question that's worth noting here, in that, there is this transition phase we're going through where, I was just talking to the client I'm at here today, this week, that I'm visiting with. We were having this conversation yesterday with their leadership team about what is the future of ERP. Is now really a time to double down on a technology that may be going away or maybe significantly changing as a category overall? And that's one of the big challenges that I think organizations have to face, or one of the big unknowns is what's going to happen to the big monolithic ERP vendors. Are they going to ride the AI train and the AI wave successfully, or is someone else going to come in and disrupt it like some already are? And is that going to destroy, or at the very least minimize, the importance of that whole ERP software category? I don't have a good answer to that question, but it is something that we have to think about, is how do we manage this transition from the way technology is today to where it's going to be in the future? And then in the meantime, how do we manage data? How do we manage our processes? How do we manage our business? And I think the key here is to recognize a couple things. One is we don't have all the answers. None of us do. We don't really know what's going to happen here in the next 3, 5, or 10 years as it relates to enterprise technology, which leads me to the second point, which is even more important, which is businesses need to do what's right for their business. I mean, they have to look at what they know today, recognize there's some things they don't know, recognize there's uncertainty no matter what you do. But the one thing that's certain is if you don't manage these sorts of projects well, you're going to have problems. You're going to have challenges. You're going to spend way too much time and money on it. So let's focus on managing that risk, because right now the only thing that's certain is these projects are they're difficult. They're just difficult to manage. They're challenging. Oftentimes they get distressed along the way. So we have to recognize that this is the landscape we're dealing with. We might want it to be different, but it's not. So how do we manage that accordingly? I think is one of the really important things we've got to manage here. So another comment here from Sanjay on LinkedIn says most of the companies don't invest much in upskilling employees in the technology sector. I think I mentioned that one already. Sorry about that. This is the one I meant to pull up here. This is another comment from LinkedIn. Digital transformation is still seen as an IT issue. Organizations rely on the applications and the IT implementation teams to perform the heavy lift. Most organizations don't understand that the underlying change needs to occur within the operational confines of the organization. Processes, resource alignment, and what problems are to be addressed need to be hashed out and included in the overall plan. It's a very good point there. Ivana on LinkedIn says, thank you always for sharing such valuable information. And Diana also recognizes the Guns N' Roses reference there. So thank you. I hope you enjoy the song and the title of the book. Sam mentions on LinkedIn, it's not rock and roll, but I remember Peter, Paul, and Mary singing, "When Will They Ever Learn?" Some might argue that song is more rock than a lot of actual rock songs, but point well taken there. And that is another good song that could relate to these sorts of projects. And here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn that'll lead into some of the other points I was going to make here today. And that is, you highlight that failures usually come from misjudging the environment rather than the technology. Could you share an example of what misjudging the environment looks like in a real project? And I think the key thing here is, misjudging the environment. So one of the key things about misjudging the environment is not fully understanding the resources required to make the project successful, whether it's time, money, people, risk, all the things we have to invest in these sorts of projects to recognize what those requirements are, or they have a more optimistic view of what those projects really are. So those are all things that are worth noting. And those are examples of the things that companies oftentimes misjudge. And I think where this comes from, these unrealistic expectations and this lack of awareness of your surroundings and the environment you're stepping into in the jungle is largely driven by the technology industry itself. You have software vendors who are trying to sell software. So if they're going to sell you software, they can't be scaring you too much. They can't be setting your expectations too realistically, because you might freak out. You may not buy the software, or you may decide that you want to defer the software decision or the software investment until you manage some of the risk yourselves, which oftentimes is more internal than it is external. So that's one thing, is you've got software vendors and sales reps who are just human. And I'm not saying it's okay, but they're human. They're trying to make their commission checks, and they are going to do what they need to do to close a deal. And to close a deal, you can't be sharing too much or be too forthcoming about the risk of these projects. You had to insult to injury by throwing in the system integrators and the technology implementers, these partners of the software vendors who are heavily compensated, measured, and incentivized to sell as much software as possible, and to ensure that the client implements as many modules, as many subscriptions of the software as possible. That's their job, and that's their myopic focus. So they're going to go in with blinders to figure out a way to help you implement technology in a way that takes full advantage of the potential that you might invest in. So I think those are the big things right there. Is you have an entire industry that is wired around mismanaging expectations, not intentionally. No one had a master plan back in the day of, hey, let's mislead all the customers that are about to buy technology. But given human behavior from sales reps, from the software vendors, and over optimism from leaders, and a lack of understanding of knowing any better from the implementers, the buyers of technology, the ones that are actually going to implement the technology. You combine all those factors, and you get a perfect storm of mismanaged expectations. And then you add another layer, which is now you've got industry analysts and consultants that are paid by the software vendors to put out positive messaging related to technology. And now all of a sudden we're super excited about AI and all these cool, sexy technologies, but we're not thinking about risk, because risk is not nearly as cool to think about. It's not nearly as fun to think about it as thinking about AI and AI agents and predictive analytics and automation and all this cool stuff that could really transform our businesses if we do it right. So we're going to tend to gravitate to the shiny object. We're not going to gravitate to the stuff that isn't so shiny or fun, which unfortunately is risk management, project planning, strategy, that sort of thing. Although I think this stuff's cool. Most people don't. Some might call me strange or weird because I like that stuff, but most don't. Most are going to gravitate toward the technology. So great questions there. Thank you for that. And in just a moment, by the way, I'm going to have this awkward moment where I have to get up and move to another room. So I guess you could see maybe behind the scenes of trying to do a podcast on the road in gypsy style. That's what you'll get to see here today. So I apologize. In a few minutes here, I'm going to be walking, and we'll probably have a quick break as I switch rooms here because I am going to get kicked out of the room I'm in right now. So, I want to get into a couple case studies around the jungle, and this is something that I cover in the book. There's a lot of case studies that are peppered throughout the entire book, and I do hope you enjoy it. I hope you read it. Again, QR code right here. If you want to read about it, pre-order it now. It's only $10. You can get the electronic copy on the 28th. You'll receive it, or if you order on the 28th, you can also order the hardcover or paper back version of the book. So, and you can order it wherever in the world you are. You don't have to be in the U.S. where I am. You can be anywhere in the world and order the book electronically or the physical version of it. But some of the case studies we talk about, there's a few in particular. One is that I talk about a lot in my YouTube channel and LinkedIn newsletters and whatnot. In fact, I just posted something today on LinkedIn about this, or reposted, I should say, a newsletter I wrote a few months ago about Lidl, which had a $600 million SAP failure. They went to implement SAP S/4HANA. They scrapped the project after spending 600 million euros on 500 million euros, which is closer to 600 million US dollars on the project. And some of the core issues they had was they were trying to force some of their old processes into the new software. Although what's really interesting about this one is I'm not certain how important let me rephrase that. It is important, but I'm not certain how much this is an issue of the company not having a willingness to change versus a need that's legitimate. So in other words, whenever a client of ours wants to customize software, you have to distinguish between, is this a legitimate business need, a must-have, something that it would make sense that off-the-shelf software couldn't handle, so we know we need to customize it because it preserves the client's secret sauce or competitive advantage. But then there's other types of customization requests where it's like, well, yeah, maybe it doesn't look the same as your old legacy processes, but you don't necessarily need those old legacy processes. You could change and be fine and not lose any real advantage you have as a company. And it's usually not one answer or the other, but each process, each decision typically falls into one of those buckets. And a lot of companies have they struggle with how to navigate that and make the right decision around, is this a real business need? Is this a real thing that we do need to customize, or are we just being resistant to change? Software vendors will typically tell companies, which I don't agree with this, but they'll typically tell them, hey, you're just resisting change. We have best practices in our software. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes there is best practice in the software, if you want to call it that, even though I don't enjoy that term. Right? I think it's misleading, but that is a term that's often used in our industry. So clients or software vendors will oftentimes be dismissive of areas of competitive strength and just say, hey, just do what our software does despite its limitations, because that is what we would consider best practice. However, you have to look at this as a business and say, well, that's not best practice for us necessarily. There could be some things that, yes, if it's accounts payable related, for example, and we're going to pay our vendors, a certain way, do we really need to redesign that process? Probably not. But if it's something customer facing, or it's an area of strength that you have as an organization, you're able to ship product faster than other organizations, you're able to provide services faster. If it's something related to that and the software is actually slowing you down, off the shelf, then yeah, maybe you do need to customize the software or change it or tailor it in a way that fits what you want your business to look like. And again, it's not just one answer or the other for all your processes. Every process decision is going to fall into different buckets potentially. And so navigating that is something that's real challenging and important to navigate. So in the case of Lidl, they had a different inventory evaluation method that they used that SAP did not support. Whether or not they could have just adapted to SAP's out of the box standard, I don't know. But for whatever reason, they viewed inventory valuation and the way they handled inventory valuation, they viewed that as important. It could have been regulatory. It could have been just the way they insisted on having it. But I don't know that that's the important thing. The important thing here is how do you navigate that? What do you do when you run into a challenge like that? And that was one of the big problems they had, is they tried to change the software in the way that created a lot of challenges for them. And then the jungle metaphor, bringing it back to the Welcome to the Jungle theme here, is that, a big part of what Lidl struggled with is they refused to adapt to the new system and the new terrain. For better or for worse, they chose SAP. They didn't adapt to the software the way it was built, and they ended up changing a lot of things, and they ended up dragging some of their old baggage through the jungle instead of traveling light. So you've probably heard this concept of clean core. It's a common term in ERP in general, but especially in the world of SAP and S/4HANA. There's this concept of start with a clean core, get rid of your customization, get rid of your dirty data, and start clean with a new system. Easier said than done, of course. It's, if you're a business owner or a business executive, that may sound slightly horrifying, but from a technical perspective, a technology perspective, it can actually be a pretty effective way to implement new technology. But the problem is, this isn't about deploying technology. This is about transforming your business to change it, to improve it, to make it more competitive in the future landscape. So that's the lesson, or one of the lessons, or a couple of the lessons from Lidl. There's also, I think the big takeaway from Lidl too is that they had the ways they'd always done things and they didn't want to change. And again, there might have been some areas where they had very legitimate, solid business reasons for not changing, but there's probably a lot of areas where they refused the change, or they resisted the way SAP is built, and they probably could have changed in some cases. Now, again, it's easier said than done. They probably had good reason for pushing back on a lot of these changes, but as a strong leader, sometimes you have to know when to override or to convince people that they shouldn't be force fitting their old businesses or their old processes into the technology the way it was built. So some of the other case studies we cover in the book, another one we cover is Hershey's. Hershey's, the candy company. They went to implement and went live with a new system shortly before Halloween, which is one of the peak candy buying seasons, at least in the US and much of the Western world. And they decided, for whatever reason, that they would go live right around the time when retailers were having a spike in demand, or they're having a spike in orders for candy to stock up their shelves for Halloween. Why they chose that as a go live date, I have no idea. I don't think I'll ever fully understand that, but that is a real challenge and a real thing that they struggled with, is that they went live right before peak season. And it also turns out they had a pretty unrealistic timeline. They blew past their timeline and budget. Again, getting back to the whole unrealistic expectation thing. And I believe right now I'm probably getting kicked out. So I'm going to walk and talk as we're going here. So bear with me 1 second and I'll move. But that was one of the challenges is looking at, in the case of Halloween, making sure that they had realistic expectations going into the plan. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
You bet.
Got in there. Got done.
So some other things to think about here as it relates to this is we also recognize or see in this case study that they entered the jungle without preparation. So they didn't have a really good understanding of what they were getting into, and the timing and pacing were critical. They tended to they seemed to try to rush themselves through to manage or to go through the project there. So I'd love to hear from you too while I'm walking here. So far, based on what you're hearing, what do you think the biggest challenges are and the biggest takeaways are from this? I'd love to hear your feedback here while I'm getting settled in a new room here. Here. Okay, so that was a little bit about Hershey's. There's also another one that's a little bit more recent than Hershey's. Hershey's, by the way, was back in the late 90s, so that was about 25 years ago. But the reason in this book I pull so many different case studies from different eras in time, different types of technologies, is because you see that the patterns can repeat themselves regardless of time and place, regardless of technology, regardless of geography or location of an organization. You tend to find that these patterns repeat themselves, and that's one of the big challenges that I see in this industry. Is it doesn't seem like we've adequately learned from our mistakes to be able to avoid some of these challenges that organizations are facing. So another more recent one, that was 1999 with Hershey's. Another more recent case study in the book that's also more of a public sector example. We have a lot of case studies around the private sector and the public sector in the book, but one of the big profile case studies in the public sector is Birmingham City Council in the UK. And also somewhat related to that is Cook County in the US. So you've got Birmingham City Council in the UK, Cook County in the US. Both of these case studies we unpack in detail, but just for brevity purposes, I'll lump them together here today because they are very similar. And in both cases with Birmingham and Cook County, these are multi-million-dollar overruns. They didn't have a clear strategy and governance, and there were lawsuits in both cases. In fact, I believe Cook County is taking legal action right now against their software vendor. In fact, I was just recently interviewed on broadcast news in the US to discuss that particular case study and helping them recognize and understand and unpack why Cook County is struggling in their implementations. It was also interesting in the news segment too that I was interviewed for. It wasn't about technology or systems necessarily. It was more about how the failure is affecting citizens, which I thought was really interesting, because a lot of times in these projects, it's easy to think that, okay, yeah, we've got to worry about ourselves and make sure that our core team is taken care of. We need to make sure that employees aren't too stressed out or too burned out from the changes or too disrupted by the changes. But you also have customers and citizens that are affected. And for a government entity, there's a lot at stake. If you're in healthcare, there's a lot at stake. If you're in any sort of nonprofit or purpose-driven organization, faith-based organization, that sort of thing, you're going to have more disruption to more people than just your own internal team. And your own internal team should be enough to motivate you, but for some organizations, the stakes are even higher because the work that they do as an organization has wide-ranging consequences and impacts on people. And that was certainly the case with government, or that is the case with government examples like Birmingham City and Cook County. And so they didn't have the right alignment and oversight. So they let these projects spiral out of control. And you think about all the collateral damage from that. Employees get stressed out. You get citizens who aren't getting their tax money or their refunds from property taxes in the case of Cook County. And so the jungle metaphor here is that, in these cases, everyone was headed in different directions. There wasn't clear alignment in these organizations as far as how they were going to make decisions, what they wanted the technology to accomplish for them, what their strategy was, what their timeline was. They didn't have a realistic, aligned approach, and it wasn't well thought through. I think what happened in both cases, from what we can tell, is they deferred to the experts, the outside consultants, the outside technology vendors and providers, and based their decisions based on the input they were getting from them. And the one thing you have to keep in mind is when you're hiring a technology vendor and or a technology implementer, that's just one work stream within a broader program. So generally speaking, your overall digital transformation is a big program. Technology, your ERP provider is just one work stream within that program, but chances are pretty high you have multiple technologies with multiple technology work streams. On the non-technology side, you're going to have change management, learning and training and development. architecture, integration, data migration, all these different things that need to come together into one complete program. But when you go to a vendor, you're getting one work stream within an entire program. You're not getting the entire program, and someone needs to manage that entire program. And that someone is typically you, the leadership of the organization. And that's the big blind spot that a lot of organizations don't recognize. They don't recognize the broader program, the broader big picture. And it's a lot like, I try to equate it to another analogy or metaphor, which is if you were to build a house, let's just say you want to have a nice 2-story house with running water. Well, okay, we all want running water, but we're not going to call the plumber on day one to come in and build, do the piping and the plumbing when the foundation hasn't even been built yet. We haven't done the framing. We haven't done anything yet. So the last thing you need is a plumber showing up on site on day one of your construction job of a new house. But that's essentially what organizations are doing when they hire software vendors. They're bringing in the plumber on day one, and they are not ready for the plumber. They've got a lot more stuff that they need to do for the overall program, the overall transformation, the overall house, if you will. So that's the sort of thing that needs a change in the industry. Is we have to recognize the reality of what it is we're doing. We're not implementing technology. We're not plumbing. We're not implementing we're not implementing running water. We're implementing a house we can live in with running water. And so you need to plan accordingly. You need that general contractor to help manage all the pieces and have that clear plan of how all the pieces tie together. And that's where a lot of clients will hire us for help, is to do exactly that. So I'm going to get to a couple audience questions here before I keep going on here, and with more case studies, although I've got a lot more to cover. Some really good ones here. Here's a question that I think we'll answer as we go through the conversation here. This is from 𝗟𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗡 on LinkedIn. It says, could you please share the common blind spot for the companies that fail transformation? I think we just talked about one, and I'll get to more here as we go through some of these case studies. Here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, since the jungle metaphor resonates, do you see each of these case studies as a different kind of jungle danger, such as predators equating to vendor bias, storms equating to unrealistic timelines, baggage equating to customization, etc.? And yes, I do actually think that each case study has some differences, but when you start to look at a bunch of case studies, like in the book, you'll see, I don't know, at least 20 or 30 different case studies that are peppered throughout. You'll see some common patterns. I mean, some of them are different. Now, you put two failures side by side, they're going to look a little bit different. But when you look at 10, 20, 30 of them side by side, which we do as a consulting company, that's what we do in our expert witness practice, is we go in and we analyze failures. When it's a project recovery where we have to get the project back on track, we will analyze those as well. And you start to see a lot of the same patterns. It may not be exactly the same side by side, but you start to see, a handful of, 10 to 15 common mistakes that are commonly repeated. Maybe not all 10 to 15 all at once, but most companies have several of those 10 or 15 common failure points. And what we're doing here today is trying to talk about some of the biggest ones. Some of the most common ones are what we're covering here in today's case studies, but the book itself gets into a lot more detail. Here's a comment from Sam on LinkedIn. It's quite incredible that Lidl got so far into the project before realizing that there was a fundamental issue. That's a great point, and something I glossed over, which is, how do you let several $100 million slip through your fingers before calling a timeout and saying, wait, hold on, something doesn't seem right here? A lot of these projects just get completely out of control, and shame on the vendor and the system integrator for letting things spiral out of control and not managing the project better, but shame on the organization too for not having better visibility. I always equate these sorts of projects or contrast them to big capital investments that companies might make in other areas, like building a new factory, or if they were to go do a big acquisition, they're going to acquire another company. They would do tons of due diligence, tons of planning. They would dive in and they would try to uncover every nook and cranny of understanding where the risk is, what they're getting themselves into. If they're building a factory, they're definitely not going to let it go 5, 10 times over budget, 5 or 10 times past the timeline. They just wouldn't let it happen. But yet on these technology projects, it's almost like everyone's too scared or unaware of how to manage the projects better, which I don't fully understand, because there's plenty of people out there that do know how. It's just a matter of how do you put all the pieces together. Despite an industry that has a bad track record, there are some very smart people in this industry that can help you. So the question is, how do you leverage more of that help to be more successful? Here's another question here, a comment from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, you point out that organizations often defer to vendors or consultants and forget they're only buying one work stream of a bigger program. If you're advising leadership teams, what's the simplest way to keep that general contractor mindset front and center? That's a great question, because I'd say the biggest way to do this is to remember that it's your project, right? It's not your vendors, it's not your consultants, it's not your system integrator or technology implementer. It's your project. You're the one that has to make sure this is successful. And that's where companies tend to fail, is they think, well, it's not my responsibility. I hired Accenture, I hired SAP, I hired Microsoft, I hired some big name to take care of this for me, and they failed me. And that's a cop-out, to be honest. I mean, if I'm just being candid, that's not a good excuse. I mean, if you hire an employee who's awful and is sabotaging your business, maybe they're stealing from you, I don't know, they're doing some terrible stuff in your organization, you're probably not just going to stand by and let them do it because you're not the expert of what that employee knows or does. So you're just going to let it ride. It just wouldn't fly. So why are you letting it fly with a technology project? And that's where I get frustrated sometimes with buyers in the industries, because ultimately, just like any big business decision or investment or risk that you take on as a business, you have to manage that risk, and you have to ultimately be the one that pivots, that changes strategy, changes course when they need to, swaps out resources if you need to. That's up to you to do. If you need to bring in third-party independent tech agnostic support, for example, you can go hire a company like ours, like Third Stage, to come help. You don't need approval or even buy-in from your other contractors. You don't need someone who's going to be threatened by the fact that someone's going to come in and hold them to be accountable and help manage them better than they can manage themselves. That's you, the business, that are going to live with the consequences. It's your checkbook, it's your time, it's your resources. You need to make sure you manage it. And Sam on LinkedIn just said it much better than I just did, much more concisely. There's a difference between delegation and abdication, which is a great line of thought. I love that line of thought. There's a book out there called 𝗟𝗄𝗎 Revisited, I think it's called. It's about scaling businesses. And they talk a lot about this exact point here, which is you can delegate, but you can't completely abdicate responsibility. You're still responsible, just like you're responsible for your employees. You delegate to them, but you are responsible if they do something. You might have to fire that person. You might have to hold them accountable, but it's ultimately on you to make the decision you need to make to manage that. And that's a really important, well said point, Sam. So thank you for that. I'm going to get into just one more case study here in the interest of time. And then I want to get into some of the common themes that we see across all these different case studies, and some of the case studies we've talked about here today, and a lot of the case studies we haven't talked about. So one last case study, though, before I get to that, is an organization called SAAQ, which is in Quebec, Canada, in the province of Quebec in Canada. There is something called SAAQ, which is their motor vehicle authority. And it's a French phrase. I took 2 years of French in high school, just enough to be dangerous. I'm not going to try and pronounce it, but SAAQ is a French term that essentially means it's the Society for Automotive something in Quebec. And it's essentially where you go to get your car registered, pay your taxes for your car and all that stuff. So they recently had an implementation that got really interesting and really dramatic, I'd say. They not only had a failure that was over $1 billion Canadian dollars of implement, and I did say 1 billion with a B, not an M, with a B. They spent 1.1 billion Canadian dollars, and it left citizens unable to renew their licenses. It caused a ton of chaos. And some of the root causes of what happened with them was that they had inadequate change management training. They didn't really address the people side of the equation. And it was a lot like, going back to the jungle metaphor, it was a lot like sending your people into the jungle without any preparation or training, without a compass, without a roadmap, without survival tools. You're sending them out into the jungle without supporting them when you don't invest in change management training and adoption to the degree that you would need to. So that's, an important takeaway here, is that change management is absolutely critical. It was certainly critical here with SAAQ, and you want to make sure you don't underestimate that human side. Training communication is just part of that too, by the way. It's not just taking your boilerplate off the shelf generic training materials that your vendor provides you and rolling it out to your employees. You've got to tailor that for your workflows, the way you've configured the software. You've got to tailor it for your specific language and way of communicating with customers and amongst yourselves internally. And so that takes a lot of work, and that's just on the training side. Then you get into change impacts. How are people's jobs going to change? And how can I train them and educate them in advance of end user software training? How can I train them on their new processes? If I'm deploying new tools like AI or any other sort of automation that's going to disrupt a job, someone's job, what's going to happen to their job? What's that going to look like? And how can I communicate that to them and get them prepared for the change before I get to end user training shortly before go live? Because if you wait until then to start communicating changes and helping people understand their new jobs and how they're going to spend their time now that you've automated part of their jobs, if you wait until then, they're going to have their freak out moment way too late in the project. You need those freak out moments to happen early on, because they will freak out when you tell them you're going to automate their job, you're going to take away that spreadsheet, you're going to somehow rock their world in some way. They need to hear that as soon as possible, and they need to have time to work through that, and you need to have time to work through that with them. And by the way, they might have good ideas on how to make the process better that you're in the middle of designing. So the sooner you can get that feedback and reaction from employees, the better. And again, if you wait too long and wait until end user training in a classroom or online training or whatever it is, if you wait until then and they're hearing about these major changes for the first time, and I'm not talking about major change like we're implementing a new system, I'm talking about we're going to take away your spreadsheet. We are going to force you to enter new information in the system that you don't have to enter now. Or we are going to force you to have more visibility into more processes, and you're going to analyze more data using these tools. All that is stuff that is going to have a lot of questions, a lot of concern, and you've got to work through that as early as possible in the process. And not to mention, if you really want to take advantage of technology, full advantage of technology, you can't just train people and expect that you're going to get business value. You're going to have to do the heavy lifting of changing their jobs, changing the focus of what they do, because chances are pretty high the technology is going to allow them to do more without having to hire more people. So the true way to get that value is to map out those processes and the change impacts to the people as soon as possible. So it's going to help you with training. It's going to help you with communication. It's going to help you achieve more business value. It's going to help you avoid business disruption, operational disruption at the time of go live. One of the recent metrics, or one of the metrics we've tracked over the years, including recently, is that just over 50% of organizations have a material operational disruption at the time they go live. So they can't ship product, can't close the books, can't run payroll, something major like that. They could last anywhere from a couple of weeks to several months. And excuse me. So it's really important that you look at not only the cost of your direct implementation, but what's the cost on the other side? What if we don't manage risk, and what's that going to cost us if we can't ship product for a month, or we can't run payroll? What's that going to look like? And chances are pretty high you're going to be able to justify real quickly spending more time and money and resources to get it right up front. Because too often organizations aren't even thinking what happens on the other side. All they're focused on is, how do I get out of this unscathed? How do I minimize the amount of time and money I'm spending on this project right now? And how do I move on with my life and go back to running my business? It's fair enough. It's understandable why organizations think that way, but you don't want to do that in the name of rushing through things when you may have, congratulations, you may have reduced your time and cost on the implementation, but now you've just increased your long-term cost and add a huge amount of disruption and risk to the business itself. That's the worst case scenario, but that's where so many organizations end up after these projects, is because they're so focused on stopping the bleeding during implementation, because, like I said before, they had unrealistic expectations. They didn't have a realistic plan. They didn't have a complete plan. Their vendor gave them overly optimistic rose-colored glass assumptions in their plan. All those things could be part of the reason why these organizations struggle, and they tend to have issues after the fact as a result of that. So that's those are the case studies there. And I want to get now into just a few of the lessons here in just a moment. But first, I'll get to a couple questions here. Sanjay on LinkedIn says, how do you see AI going to change the way business processes work? And I think that's a great question that a lot of organizations haven't thought about, including organizations that are marching down the path of AI. They haven't thought through how they want AI to change their business. They're waiting for a software vendor to give them a tool that will show them what to do, but a lot of times they haven't thought through it enough to say, you know what, if we were to pick one area, here's an area of our business where agentic AI or generative AI might help us tremendously. It might add a huge amount of value to our customers, might make our employee jobs a lot easier. So let's just start there and let's figure out a way we can use AI in these areas. And the good thing about AI is it's almost like you have unlimited creativity in how you can use technology. I mean, there's so many different things you can do with AI that you could probably literally do about anything you want with AI. So you're not going to boil the ocean. You're not going to change your entire business overnight. So let's focus on the area where you could get the most value, the quickest wins, get the most ROI on the investment you might make in new technology. So that's what I think is happening with AI is I don't think enough people know how they want to use AI, and they're looking to vendors, whether it's ERP vendors like SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, to give them AI tools or show them AI tools, or they're turning to other third-party vendors to just see what options are out there and exploring the way those processes can change. But I think the good thing, again, with AI is it allows you to implement technology that could have a huge impact at a lower cost and lower risk than if you were to replace your entire ERP system. And we have a lot of clients now, an emerging, growing subset of clients that are saying, we're gonna punt or kick the can down the road on ERP, and we're going to focus on AI right now because we can get more immediate value. It's less risky. We don't know what's going to happen to ERP long term. We don't know, if SAP is still going to be the dominant player, if Microsoft's going to be the dominant player, or is it going to be someone else that we don't even know about yet, because the tech space is changing so quickly right now, and it's being disrupted in a way that I've never seen. And so I think the leaders, the incumbents, are going to look a lot different in a few years than they look right now. And a lot of our clients recognize that too, and they're deciding to wait and focus on lower hanging fruit, lower risk. They last thing many of them want right now is to get locked into one vendor that may or may not be relevant in 5 or 10 years from now. And that's a real risk, I would say. If you're looking at one of the big guys, one of those traditional incumbent monolithic ERP providers, you do have to ask yourself, what's the risk that they aren't the big giant gorilla anymore in the future? And what does that mean for our overall digital strategy? So you've got to factor that uncertainty, that risk into your overall plan. And a lot of organizations are doing that by avoiding the whole idea of replacing their ERP systems altogether, which I know many of you in the ERP space may not want to hear, and it may run counter to what you're hoping happens, but that is what we're seeing with a growing number of our clients right now. So it leads to the question, well, what are the root causes of failure? We've talked a lot about these case studies. We've talked about the book. And again, if you're just joining or didn't catch it the first time or haven't scanned it yet, if you scan this QR code right here, you can pre-order my new book. You can read about it. You can see what it's about. You can look at the table of contents on there as well. So be sure to scan that and check that out. And I appreciate your support on the book too. If you can share it with people, I'm trying to get the word out to as many people as possible, which is part of why I'm doing this topic here this week. But what are the lessons then? What are the patterns that we see in these failures? You have one thing we talked about, lack of clear vision and alignment. So there's no clarity around what it is we're trying to accomplish with this project. This is something that's becoming increasingly difficult for organizations because a lot of them feel like they're being forced into an upgrade or forced into a big technology change, but they don't necessarily have clarity around what it is they want to accomplish beyond just satisfying a vendor who's saying they're going to stop supporting the product going forward. So that's something you need to have a clear North Star of what it is you're trying to accomplish with the project before you go too far down the path. We talked a lot about unrealistic expectations. So assuming the jungle will be easier than you think, that's a big mistake because that leads you to a lot of bad decisions later on when you realize you don't have the time and money and resources that you thought you did, and that causes and leads to some poor decision making later on. You also have resistance to change. So people just do not like changing. Organizations don't like changing. I don't care who you are. Some organizations change a little bit easier than others, but if you are a well-established organization that's been around for a long time, for example, I'm at a client right now. It's I think 3rd or 4th generation family owned. It's been around for 100+ years in the Midwest United States. They manufacture stuff. They are good at changing when it comes to new products and satisfying their customers, but they are not good at changing when it comes to implementing technology. And they'll be one of the first to admit that. And most of our clients, that's true. And that's not an indictment. It's not a judgment. It's not a good or bad thing. It's just the reality is that organizations, the bigger you are, the more complex you are, the more established you are, the harder it is going to be to change, no matter how cool the technology is, no matter how well-intentioned your people seem. It's just going to be difficult. It just is. And that's okay. The key is, let's not deny reality. Let's accept reality for what it is. Let's not judge reality. That is the way it is. We're not going to change that. We aren't going to change the fact that people don't like change and organizations don't like change. So let's navigate it. Rather than complaining that people don't like to change or that we don't like to change, let's just navigate the fact that it is going to be painful, but we can do things to overcome that and to help people through the change. A vendor and integration bias, that's another root cause of failure. So vendors and integrators, they are really good at drinking the Kool-Aid. They are all double down on their product. Their product is the best thing out there since sliced bread, in their opinion. They're out there paying people to tout the same message. Their echo chamber reinforces that to them, and they will then tell you, the buying organization, that their software is awesome, no risk or low risk, not that difficult to implement, plenty of successful client case studies, blah, 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 all the stuff that helps sell software. That echo chamber, that bias, all creates a lot of problem, not only in the decision-making process, but also when you're implementing too. A lot of times we work with, when we're helping clients through their implementation on the program management side, we'll be the ones oftentimes to say, wait, why are we trying to force fit this technology into this part of the business? That might be the technology we're rolling out across the organization, but for this part of the business, it doesn't make sense. Maybe we do something different. Maybe we do a third-party bolt-on that has nothing to do with that software vendor. It's not the end of the world, although the vendor themselves will want you to use as much of their software as possible because they make more money that way. So you have to look at it from a business perspective and say, well, maybe that's not the best thing for us. Maybe there's a better option out there, and let's be objective about that. And so a vendor and integrator bias is something that's a big challenge. Weak governance and leadership is another big challenge. A lot of times organizations don't have that clear direction on how decisions are going to be made. They'll have these blanket philosophies around no customization, or we're going to use the software out of the box the way it was built. We're going to change our process to fit the software. And those blanket statements aren't super helpful. It's a good goal to set, but you're not going to achieve that in most cases. You're going to have to pivot. You're going to have to make adjustments to your plan. And the problem is organizations don't think about how we make the decision when the universal blanket philosophy needs to change for a certain exception. And if you don't have the right governance and the right framework in place, it's going to be a lot more difficult to navigate that. So governance and leadership is important. And then finally, last but not least, neglecting change management. Organizations that neglect change management, they forget that people have to adapt. They have to learn the new processes, the new way of working, the new technologies, the new job roles and responsibilities. All that stuff becomes super important as you go through these projects. And yet so many organizations don't have that clarity. They don't take the time to define what their processes are going to be, how jobs are going to change, what they want their future state to be, what they want to be when they grow up. All that stuff oftentimes doesn't materialize the way they would like or hope. So those are the takeaways, some of the takeaways from the book. Now, of course, if you read the book, you get a lot more detail than what we've talked about here today. But those are some of the big takeaways. Just a couple questions I want to get to before we wrap up here. Jeremy on LinkedIn says, great Q&A, Eric. How do you create the shared vision when there's no consensus about AI use in the organization? Any tips? Well, I think the thing with AI is it's so new and it's so uncertain, and people are still unclear as to how it could help their businesses or their jobs, that you have to pick off almost a pilot area. This is where a more agile, smaller scale approach might help, is to say, let's look at an area where we know there could be a lot of efficiency gain. Like, for example, last week I was talking to a client where customer service, they're spending a lot of time looking for information. They're spending a lot of time creating custom quotes for customers. And that's a great example of low-hanging fruit that you could not easily, but more easily deploy in an isolated fashion AI agents that allow the customer service reps to gather that information faster and provide more accurate information to customers. So let's hone in on that. It's going to have top line revenue growth. Our customers are going to be more satisfied if we do it right. Our employees are going to be happier. So we know there's a huge amount of upside potential here. We know it's not going to be easy, but we know it's something we can isolate to the customer service group without having to rip out our entire back office systems across the company. So that's where I would start. Is I would start small. I would start with an area in your business that has high potential, high value, and then look at where could AI help, whether it's agentic AI, whether it's generative AI, the conversational AI where you use prompts to get information. I think that's something that's widespread. You could use anywhere in your organization, but I'm thinking more about the real heavy lift around AI as far as like the agentic or the generative AI sides of it. So the good thing again is you can experiment with those technologies at a relatively low risk. It's not like an ERP implementation where if you screw it up, you're screwing up everything. You're screwing up the entire end-to-end process because you broke one part of the chain. You can still break AI. You can still completely botch the implementation, but the downside impact is probably going to be a lot less negative than some of the impact to a failed ERP project or a HR tech project or whatever the case may be. So if you isolate it to one area, start there, and then learn from it. How could we generate additional ideas from that on how we might use that same approach in other parts of the business? That's where there's a lot of value there. So thank you for that great question, Jeremy. 𝗟𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗡 on YouTube says, "Hello, Eric, listening to your podcast for some time now." And then a follow-up question from 𝗟𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗡. "We're mapping out EU insurance digital transformation niche. What would you advise as a software vendor to focus on? What do insurance companies need the most?" Honestly, don't know what insurance companies need the most. I'm not an expert or a guru in the insurance industry, but I pull it up here just in case anyone else has any ideas for you or thoughts on what the industry might need. I would assume if I'm just speculating here, my hypothesis would be it'd be something customer service related, something with customer interaction. Maybe it's claims. Is there a way to speed up the claims process? Is there a way to use AI to sift through claims or to identify claims that might need more due diligence behind it, or more, how do you detect fraud in the claims process? Something along those lines where you could use AI to identify those sorts of things would be my guess, but open it up to any audience discussion here. Here's an interesting question that we did not get to yet. This is from 𝗷𝗂𝗢𝗡𝗦 on YouTube. 𝗷𝗂𝗢𝗡 says, "Hope you're doing well. What is the future of big ERP giants or industry move towards customized ERPs built in-house by using AI?" This is a huge question. I think it's a really good one. I don't know. I think there's something here. I think you're identifying a movement that will likely happen in the industry. I think it's going to take some time for companies to get comfortable with this idea, but I do think it's something that will have merit longer term, because as organizations realize, wait a minute, I don't need to go pay all this money to get locked into a vendor who has the right to increase prices whenever they want. They have a right to do reviews or audits of my usage of the software. They might charge me more there. If I, God forbid, decide I want to move to a different software vendor someday, that's going to be a huge pain, and I'm locked in. And in some cases, the vendor is going to cut off support, or they're going to force me into a cloud situation I may or may not want, that sort of thing. So I think as organizations realize, wow, I don't have to be stiff-armed by the software vendors. I could create my own, especially if I've got parts of my business that are super niche-y or super secret sauce types processes where it's our differentiator, it's our competitive advantage, is why we are successful. Why not create an asset that you own, that you could have on your balance sheet that it adds to the value of the company? To me, that is not a terrible idea. Again, the traditional way of thinking would be, well, why would you do that? You could just use off-the-shelf software. Yeah, you could use off-the-shelf software maybe for some of your basic, more vanilla processes, but why not build your own for part of your business that's super unique, or make it harder to replicate for a competitor? If your ERP vendor provides the capabilities, or you just conform to your ERP vendor, you're conforming to average, you're conforming to the rest of the industry. And most businesses don't want, at least in the for-profit private sector, they don't want to be average. They don't want to conform to the industry. They want to be different. They want to beat their competition. They want to do better. And so why not use IT as a competitive differentiator? You look at companies like, if you look at Walmart, if you look at Netflix, Amazon, look at some of these companies that have used technology to totally change their business over the last few decades. Let's use those three examples: Walmart, Amazon. I forgot the other one I mentioned. Lyft is another one, Lyft or Uber. These companies did not grow and succeed and become unicorns in their industries by using commercial off-the-shelf software. In some cases, they might be using it in parts of their business, but they didn't do it by using SAP or Microsoft or something. They built their own software that's super hard to replicate, that gave them a unique business model, a competitive advantage. So the question is, do you have parts of your business that you could do a similar strategy, and could you use AI to help you do that faster? In the past, maybe it wasn't realistic, but now it could be, with AI helping you with coding, and you don't need as big of a development staff now as you might have needed in the past with AI. So maybe now things are different. The barrier to entry is a bit lower for companies to do this on their own if they want to. Once they do it, it becomes harder to replicate, although it can be replicated faster now than it could have in the past. But it still does potentially give you a leg up or a differentiator that others may not have. So that's a great question. And to follow up on Jeremy's questions, the follow-up to the how to start with AI, the follow-up question is, so start with one department and make a success story. And there's a follow-up comment. And yes, I do agree with that. Get a quick win, learn from it, and then start to scale it out through other parts of your business. And then you build confidence too. Once the rest of the business sees how one part of the business was successful using AI and people get excited about it, then that starts to spread. If you try to do it all at once too fast, it's going to be too confusing, too chaotic, especially with AI being relatively immature compared to other technologies. And when I say immature, I don't mean the technology necessarily. I mean people's use of the technology is relatively immature. So that's something that needs to be managed through. Well, I think that covers it. There's other questions I didn't get to here today, but in the interest of time, I will wrap up here. But I want to encourage you again, and thank you in advance for supporting the book, Welcome to the Jungle. If you scan the QR code right here, you can read more about what it's about. You can pre-order it for $9.99 US. On the 28th, you'll get the copy as soon as it's available, right on the 28th. And if you'd like, you can also get a hardcover copy or paperback physical copy on the 28th, or beginning September 28th as well. So be sure to keep an eye on that, or keep that link, or keep that in your bookmarks for buying the book. If you don't buy it now, you can buy it on the 28th and get the physical copy as well. So I want to thank you very much for your time. We'll do this same time, same place every week. Appreciate your time and interest in the book. If you have other questions you want to follow up with, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or YouTube. You can also reach me on email. I've included all my contact information below. So I hope you have a great day and have a great week in the meantime. And we'll see you next week on the next live stream. This interview, by the way, will get edited and polished, especially with all the weird relocations I had here today during the session. We'll edit it, we'll polish it, we'll add additional content to it, and we'll release it as a formal episode of Transformation Ground Control next week. So be sure to keep an eye on that. You can see all the past episodes at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So thanks very much for being here today. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.